Chapter 6, Unit 6, Market Failure and the Role of Government. 6.1 Socially Efficient and Inefficient Market Outcomes. The big idea, what does efficient actually mean? Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but trips up a surprising number of students on the AP exam. What does it mean for a market to be efficient? In everyday life, we might say a car is efficient if it gets great gas mileage, or a worker is efficient if they finish tasks quickly. But in economics, efficiency has a very specific meaning, and getting that definition right is worth points on both the multiple choice and the free response. A market outcome is socially efficient. College Board also calls this allocatively efficient when it produces the quantity of a good at which marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost, or MSB equals MSC. That's the magic equation for this entire section. So write it on your hand if you have to. At this quantity, society is squeezing every last drop of net benefit out of its resources. No deadweight loss exists. The total surplus, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, is maximized. Think of it like a perfectly split pizza where everyone gets exactly the slice they value most and nothing goes to waste. Now, here's where students get confused. Being socially efficient doesn't necessarily mean the market is fair or equal. A market can be perfectly efficient and still have enormous inequality. Efficiency is about the size of the pie, not how it's divided. The AP exam loves to test this distinction, so burn it into your memory. Efficiency is not equity. The competitive market as the benchmark. When a competitive market has no externalities, meaning all costs and benefits are captured by the buyers and sellers themselves, the equilibrium price and quantity that the market naturally reaches happen to coincide with the socially efficient outcome. Why? Because in a competitive market, the demand curve represents marginal private benefit. And when there are no external benefits, that equals marginal social benefit. Similarly, the supply curve represents marginal private cost, and with no external costs, that equals marginal social cost. So when supply equals demand, you automatically get MSB equals MSC. Beautiful, right? On your standard supply and demand graph, the socially efficient quantity is the equilibrium quantity, where the two curves cross. At this point, every unit produced up to Q generates at least as much benefit to society as it costs, and no unit beyond Q is worth producing because the cost exceeds the benefit. The total area of consumer surplus plus producer surplus, that triangle between the demand and supply curves, is at its maximum. This is the graph you already know from Unit 1, and College Board is essentially telling you that graph represents the efficiency ideal that markets can achieve when everything works perfectly. When markets fail, socially inefficient outcomes. Here's where it gets interesting. Markets don't always hit that efficiency sweet spot, and when they don't, we call it market failure. There are two directions a market can miss. It can overproduce relative to the socially efficient quantity, or it can underproduce. Both create deadweight loss. That triangular area on a graph representing units where either the social cost exceeded the social benefit, overproduction, or the social benefit exceeded the social cost, but the units weren't produced, underproduction. Deadweight loss is the visual representation of inefficiency, and you absolutely must be able to draw and identify it. Consider overproduction first. Imagine a factory that pumps pollution into a river while making steel. The factory's private costs don't include the harm done to downstream communities. That's a negative externality. The supply curve, reflecting only private costs, sits too far to the right of where it would be if all social costs were included. The market produces too much steel at too low a price. On your graph, the marginal social cost curve sits above the supply curve, MSC greater than MPC, and the market equilibrium quantity exceeds the socially efficient quantity. The wedge between MSC and MSB at the market quantity multiplied across those extra units gives you the deadweight loss triangle, a region that appears to the right of Q end below the MSC curve, but above the MSB curve. Now flip it. Imagine a homeowner who plants a beautiful garden. Neighbors enjoy walking past it every day, but the homeowner only considers their own enjoyment when deciding how much to spend on flowers. That's a positive externality, a benefit that spills over to others but isn't captured in the private market transaction. The demand curve only reflects private benefit, so it sits too far to the left of where it should be if all social benefits were counted. The market underproduces. The MSB curve sits above the demand curve, MSB greater than MPB, and the equilibrium quantity falls short of Q. Your deadweight loss triangle now appears to the left of Q, below the MSB curve, but above the MSC curve. Those are units that would have benefited society more than they cost, but were never produced. Drawing the graphs, a step-by-step picture. For the AP exam, you need to draw these graphs confidently and label them precisely. Start with your standard supply and demand framework. For a negative externality in production, draw your normal supply curve and label it S equals MPC. Then draw a second supply curve shifted upward and to the left. Label it MSC and mark the socially efficient quantity Q where MSC intersects demand, which equals MPB equals MSB in this case. Mark the market equilibrium quantity QM where MPC intersects demand. Shade the deadweight loss triangle between QM and Q star, bounded above by MSC and below by the demand curve. For a positive externality in consumption, the mirror image applies. Draw demand as MPB, add MSB above it, find Q where MSB crosses supply MSC, and shade the deadweight loss between QM and Q bounded above by MSB and below by supply. Exam traps and FRQ precision. The most common trap on multiple choice is confusing the direction of the shift. Students hear negative externality in production and mistakenly draw a demand shift. Don't. Production externalities shift the cost curves. Consumption externalities shift the benefit curves. Another trap? Assuming that a higher price always means overproduction or a lower price means underproduction. Focus on quantity, relative to the socially efficient level, not just price. On free response questions, College Board's rubric is ruthless about two things: your labels and your logic. Always label MSC and MSB explicitly, writing supply or demand when you mean the social curves will cost you points. And when explaining deadweight loss, don't just draw the triangle. State that it represents the net loss to society from producing at a quantity other than the socially efficient level. That phrasing directly echoes the language graders are looking for. This section connects tightly to Unit 1's surplus analysis and to Unit 4's discussion of competitive market equilibrium. Everything you're building here about efficiency and deadweight loss becomes the foundation you'll need as we move into the specific causes of market failure: externalities, public goods, and the government interventions designed to correct them. 6.2 Externalities. What is an externality? Let's start with a story. Imagine you're sitting at that coffee shop I mentioned, enjoying your morning latte when the person at the next table lights up a cigarette. You didn't ask for that smoke. You're not paying for it, but you're absolutely experiencing it in your lungs, in your hair, in your general mood. That right there is the essence of an externality, a cost or benefit that falls on a third party who is not involved in the transaction. The buyer and seller made their deal, but you, the uninvited guest, are bearing a consequence you never agreed to. That's what makes externalities a form of market failure, and market failure is the entire theme of Unit 6. The College Board wants you to define an externality precisely. It is a side effect of production or consumption that affects third parties and is not reflected in the market price. Keep that phrase, "not reflected in the market price," locked in your memory because it explains everything that follows. Negative externalities. When the market produces too much, a negative externality imposes a cost on third parties. The classic example is a factory dumping pollution into a river while producing steel. The factory pays its workers, buys its ore, and ships its product, but it doesn't pay the downstream fishing community whose livelihoods it's destroying. That unpaid cost is called the external cost, and because the producer isn't bearing it, the market price of steel is artificially low. A low price means consumers buy more than they would if the full cost were included. The result? The market overproduces. Here's where your graph becomes essential, so let's build it carefully. Draw your standard supply and demand diagram. Label the demand curve, which also represents the marginal private benefit, or MPB, and your original supply curve, which represents the marginal private cost, or MPC. These two curves intersect at the market equilibrium, giving you price P market and quantity Q market. Now, above the MPC curve, draw a second supply curve shifted upward and to the left. This new curve is the marginal social cost, or MSC. The vertical distance between MSC and MPC at any quantity represents the marginal external cost, the per unit harm imposed on third parties. The socially optimal equilibrium is where MSC intersects the demand curve, giving you a higher price P optimal and a lower quantity Q optimal. The key takeaway for the AP exam: with a negative production externality, the market quantity Q market is greater than the socially optimal quantity Q optimal, and the market price is too low. The market overproduces relative to the social optimum. The deadweight loss triangle is critical here. It sits between Q optimal and Q market, bounded above by the MSC curve and below by the MPB demand curve. This triangle represents the net loss to society from those extra units that get produced and consumed, even though their social cost exceeds their social benefit. On an FRQ, if you're asked to show deadweight loss, shade this triangle clearly and label it. Graders are looking for it. Positive externalities. When the market produces too little. Now flip the story. You get a flu shot. You did it to protect yourself, sure, but you also reduce the chance that your roommate, your grandmother, and the stranger on the subway would catch the flu from you. Those people received a benefit they didn't pay for. That's a positive externality of consumption, a benefit that spills over to third parties beyond the buyer. For the graph, you now add a second demand curve above and to the right of the original demand curve called the marginal social benefit, or MSB. The vertical distance between MSB and MPB, the original demand, represents the marginal external benefit, the per-unit gain enjoyed by third parties. The socially optimal outcome is where the original supply curve, MPC equals MSC, since there's no external cost here, intersects the MSB curve. This gives you Q optimal, which is greater than Q market. The market underproduces. The deadweight loss triangle now sits between Q market and Q optimal, bounded above by MSB and below by MPC. Supply. The market produces too little of goods with positive externalities, and the price is too high relative to the social optimum. You should also be comfortable with positive externalities of production, such as a tech company whose R&D produces knowledge that benefits other firms. In this case, the MPC is above the MSC. The social cost of production is actually lower than the private cost, which again leads to underproduction. The graph mechanics are the same, a rightward shift now of the social cost curve below the private cost curve. Corrective policies. Internalizing the externality. The solution in all cases is to internalize the externality, to bring those external costs or benefits back into the market price so producers and consumers face the true social cost or benefit. For negative externalities, the government can impose a Pigouvian tax equal to the marginal external cost at the optimal quantity. This shifts the MPC curve up to equal MSC, pushing the market equilibrium to Q optimal. For positive externalities, a Pigouvian subsidy equal to the marginal external benefit shifts MPB up to MSB or MPC down to MSC, again reaching Q optimal. The AP exam frequently asks you to identify the correct size of the tax or subsidy, and the answer is always the marginal external cost or benefit at the socially optimal quantity, not at the market quantity. That distinction trips up many students. Common traps and connections. The MCQ traps in this topic are specific and predictable. First, students confuse negative externalities with negative outcomes for producers. They're not the same thing. A negative externality means third parties are harmed, not that the producer loses money. Second, students sometimes draw the corrective tax shifting the demand curve instead of the supply curve for a production externality. Remember, if it's a production externality, the supply curve shifts. If it's a consumption externality, the demand curve shifts. Third, watch for questions that describe a good as underproduced and ask for the type of externality that's always a positive externality, not a negative one. In terms of connections to other units, externalities link directly back to Unit 1's concept of market equilibrium and efficiency, forward to Unit 6's discussion of public goods and government intervention, and they're deeply tied to the concept of allocative efficiency. A market with an externality is allocatively inefficient because P does not equal MSC at the equilibrium quantity. You'll also connect this to the idea of consumer and producer surplus from Unit 1. Deadweight loss is the surplus that society loses because the market is producing at the wrong quantity. One more nuance worth knowing, externalities can arise from both production and consumption, and the AP exam tests both. Always identify which side of the market the externality originates from before you start drawing your graph, because that determines which curve shifts. With externalities firmly in hand, you're ready to explore what happens when markets fail even more completely, when goods have characteristics that make private production nearly impossible, which takes us into the fascinating world of public goods. 6.3 Public and Private Goods. The two big questions that define every good. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're at a fireworks show on the 4th of July. Thousands of people are watching from blankets, lawn chairs, and rooftops all around you. Now here's the thing. Did the fireworks company charge every single one of those rooftop viewers? Of course not. And could they have stopped those rooftop viewers from watching? Not really. That fireworks show, my friend, is one of the most perfect examples of a public good you'll ever encounter. And understanding why is the entire foundation of this section. The College Board wants you to classify goods using exactly two properties, and you need to know both cold rivalry and excludability. Let me define these the way the AP exam expects you to use them. A good is rival if one person's consumption of it reduces the amount available for others. A slice of pizza is rival. Once you eat it, I can't eat it. A good is excludable if people can be prevented from consuming it, typically because they haven't paid. A movie theater is excludable. They check your ticket at the door. Now here's where it gets beautiful. You take those two properties, run them like a 2x2 matrix in your head, and every good in the economy falls into one of four categories. The AP exam absolutely loves testing whether you can correctly classify goods, and it loves the edge cases, so let's walk through all four boxes carefully. The four-category framework. Private goods are both rival and excludable. This is your standard market good: a sandwich, a pair of shoes, a haircut. Markets handle private goods efficiently on their own, which is why this connects back to Unit 2 and 3 perfectly. When goods are excludable, firms can charge prices. When goods are rival, there's actual scarcity that pricing helps allocate. No market failure here. Public goods are neither rival nor excludable. This is where government intervention enters the picture. National defense is the textbook example. One person being protected by the military doesn't reduce protection for anyone else, non-rival, and it's essentially impossible to exclude a citizen from that protection, non-excludable. Other classic examples include lighthouses, broadcast radio or television signals, basic scientific research, and yes, those fireworks. Because public goods are non-excludable, the private market underprovides them. Why? Because of the free rider problem. The free rider problem is one of the most important concepts in this section for the AP exam. If you can't exclude people who don't pay, rational individuals have no incentive to voluntarily contribute. Everyone waits for someone else to pay, hoping to enjoy the benefit for free. The result is that the private market either produces 0 units or far fewer than the socially optimal quantity. This is a classic market failure. Think back to Unit 6's big theme, and it justifies government provision or subsidization of public goods. Common resources, sometimes called common pool resources, are rival but non-excludable. This is the setup for the tragedy of the commons. Think of a public fishing area. You can't prevent fishermen from using it, non-excludable, but every fish one person catches is a fish someone else cannot catch, rival. Because individuals bear no cost for depleting the shared resource, everyone overconsumes it, and the resource gets exhausted. Ocean fisheries, public grazing lands, clean groundwater aquifers, these all fit the pattern. The AP exam may ask you to identify the policy solution, which typically involves either assigning property rights, imposing regulations, or using taxes to internalize the negative externality of depletion. Artificially scarce goods, sometimes called club goods or natural monopoly goods, are non-rival but excludable. A toll road is the classic example. Once the road is built, one more car using it at 2 a.m. doesn't meaningfully reduce availability for others, non-rival, but you can absolutely put up a toll booth and exclude non-payers excludable. Streaming services, software, and cable television fit here too. Because these goods are non-rival, the marginal cost of an additional user is essentially 0, which creates a tension. Charging a price above 0 leads to deadweight loss, yet firms need revenue to cover fixed costs. This connects directly to your natural monopoly discussion and the debate over average cost pricing versus marginal cost pricing. Graphs you need to know. For public goods specifically, you need to understand how to derive the social demand curve. And this is a frequent FRQ and MCQ trap. For private goods, you find the market demand by adding quantities horizontally at any given price. How many total units do all consumers want to buy? But for public goods, since everyone consumes the same unit simultaneously, you add vertically. You stack each individual's willingness to pay on top of the others, because the question is, what is the total value society places on one unit of the public good? Here's how to draw it. Plot two individual demand curves, D1 and D2, on a graph with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. To get the social demand curve at each quantity level, you add the prices willingness to pay together. So if at Q equals 1 unit, person A is willing to pay $8 and person B is willing to pay $5, society's combined willingness to pay is $13. The social demand curve sits above both individual curves. The socially optimal quantity is where this social demand curve intersects the supply or marginal cost curve. This vertical summation versus horizontal summation distinction is one of the most tested traps in this section. Get it backward, and you'll almost certainly miss the question. Common traps and misconceptions. Here's the trap that catches the most students. Confusing public good with government-provided good. These are not the same thing. The government provides many rival and excludable goods: public universities, public transit, public swimming pools. Just because the government provides something doesn't make it a public good in the economic sense. The definition is purely about rivalry and excludability, not who produces or funds the item. Another common mistake is assuming that national parks are pure public goods. They're actually closer to common resources. They're non-excludable in spirit, but quite rival when they get crowded. Yellowstone at peak season is absolutely rival. This type of nuanced example shows up in MCQs designed to separate students who memorized examples from students who understand the framework. Connections to other units. This topic threads through the entire course. The free rider problem is a species of market failure, connecting to externalities from earlier in Unit 6. The underprovision of public goods creates a gap between private and social optimum, exactly the language you use for positive externalities in Section 6.1. The tragedy of the commons connects to negative externalities and the case for Pigouvian taxes or property rights solutions. And the artificially scarce goods category loops back to Unit 4's monopoly analysis and the pricing dilemmas of natural monopolies. Speaking of government responses to market failure, understanding when and how the government should intervene brings us to our next topic: the economics of externalities and how policymakers use taxes, subsidies, and regulation to push markets toward socially optimal outcomes. 6.4. The effects of government intervention in different market structures. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine two different neighborhoods. In one, there's a bustling farmer's market with dozens of vegetable vendors competing fiercely for your business. Prices are low, quality is high, and everyone's happy. In the other neighborhood, there's one single electric company with no competition whatsoever, charging whatever it wants for power you absolutely need. Now the government steps in to regulate both. Here's the twist. The same policy tool can produce very different outcomes depending on which neighborhood you're standing in. That's the heart of Section 6.4, and understanding it deeply is what separates a 3 from a 5 on this exam. Price ceilings in competitive markets versus monopoly. Let's start with price ceilings, because the contrast here is one of the most commonly tested ideas on the AP exam. In a perfectly competitive market, you already know from Unit 2 that equilibrium is efficient. Price equals marginal cost, consumer and producer surplus are maximized, and there's no deadweight loss. When the government imposes a binding price ceiling, that is, a maximum price below the equilibrium price, it creates a shortage, reduces producer surplus more than it increases consumer surplus, and generates deadweight loss. The market that was working perfectly now has a wedge driven into it. Think of rent control in a city with a healthy apartment market, well-intentioned, but it discourages construction and leads to housing shortages over time. Now flip to monopoly. The monopolist, as you remember from Unit 5, sets price above marginal cost, produces less than the socially optimal quantity, and creates deadweight loss on its own, without any government interference. When the government imposes a price ceiling on a monopolist, something almost magical happens, and this is a classic AP exam graph you must be able to draw. If the government sets the ceiling at the socially optimal price, where the demand curve intersects marginal cost, the monopolist's effective demand curve becomes horizontal at that ceiling price up to the quantity where the ceiling meets the original demand curve. Because the demand curve is now flat in that range, marginal revenue equals the ceiling price for those units. The monopolist now produces the competitive quantity. Price falls, output rises, deadweight loss is eliminated, and consumer surplus expands dramatically. The government has actually fixed a broken market here rather than breaking a working one. That's the crucial distinction to burn into your memory. When drawing this graph, label the original monopoly equilibrium, where MR equals MC, then draw a horizontal dashed line at the ceiling price. Show the new quantity where this ceiling intersects the MC curve. The deadweight loss triangle that existed under monopoly should now be gone. FRQ graders are specifically looking for you to identify whether surplus has shifted and whether deadweight loss has changed, so always narrate those changes explicitly in your written response. The natural monopoly problem and regulation. Government intervention in natural monopoly deserves its own close-up. A natural monopoly exists when a single firm can serve the entire market at a lower cost than 2 or more firms could. Think water utilities, electrical grids, or railroad infrastructure. The average total cost curve falls across the entire range of market demand, meaning the more you produce, the cheaper each unit becomes. Left unregulated, a natural monopoly charges a price well above marginal cost and produces inefficiently little output. The government has two main regulatory options here, and the exam loves to test the trade-offs between them. The first is marginal cost pricing, where regulators force the firm to set price equal to MC, achieving allocative efficiency. The problem? Because average total cost is still falling at that point, marginal cost lies below average total cost. The firm is forced to price below its average cost, meaning it loses money on every unit. It needs a government subsidy to survive. On your graph, you'll show the MC curve cutting the ATC curve from below, and you'll see that the MC pricing point sits in the loss region. This is efficient but financially unsustainable without support. The second option is average cost pricing, also called the fair return price, where regulators set price equal to ATC. The firm earns zero economic profit, a normal return, and stays in business without a subsidy. The trade-off is a small deadweight loss remains because price still exceeds marginal cost, but it's much smaller than the unregulated monopoly's deadweight loss. Think of it as the pragmatic compromise. Most real-world utility regulation resembles average cost pricing for exactly this reason. Antitrust policy and market structure. Beyond price regulation, the government also intervenes structurally, breaking up firms or blocking mergers to prevent markets from becoming too concentrated in the first place. The Sherman Antitrust Act and Clayton Act are the foundational U.S. laws here, though the AP exam doesn't require you to know specific legislative history. What you do need to understand is the goal: restore the competitive market structure that generates efficiency. When a market has significant monopoly power, regulators may use antitrust action to increase the number of sellers, shift the market closer to the competitive outcome, reduce price, increase output, and eliminate deadweight loss. Connect this back to Unit 4's market structures. Antitrust policy is essentially an attempt to move a market left on the spectrum from monopoly toward perfect competition. Common MCQ traps to avoid. The trap that catches students most often is assuming a price ceiling always causes a shortage or always reduces efficiency. That's only true in competitive markets. In a monopoly, a well-placed ceiling can increase output and reduce deadweight loss, the opposite of what happens in competition. When you see a question about price ceilings on the AP exam, your very first instinct should be to ask, what market structure are we in? Another trap is confusing allocative efficiency with productive efficiency. Marginal cost pricing achieves allocative efficiency but may sacrifice productive efficiency if the firm can't cover its costs. Average cost pricing achieves productive efficiency, zero economic profit, but not full allocative efficiency. Keep those definitions crisp and separate. Connections across units. This section is a beautiful synthesis of nearly everything you've studied. You're pulling Unit 2's supply and demand framework, Unit 4's market structures and profit maximization, Unit 5's monopoly graphs, and now layering government policy on top. When you see efficiency language, consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, allocative efficiency, those are Unit 2 and Unit 4 concepts being applied in a new context. The FRQ rubric rewards students who use precise terminology consistently. So practice saying the government intervention moves the market toward the socially optimal quantity, rather than vaguely saying things get better. With government intervention in market structures now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to explore the broader landscape of market failure, including the fascinating and tricky world of public goods, common resources, and the economics of information asymmetry. 6.5 Negative externalities and overproduction. Let's talk about your neighbor who decides to host a midnight bonfire every weekend. The smoke drifts into your bedroom window, ruins your sleep, and you wake up smelling like a campfire. Your neighbor is having a great time, but you're paying a cost you never agreed to. That, in essence, is a negative externality, and it's one of the most tested concepts on the entire AP Microeconomics exam. What is a negative externality? A negative externality occurs when the production or consumption of a good imposes costs on a third party who is not part of the transaction. The key phrase there is third party, someone outside the buyer-seller relationship. The College Board wants you to use precise language here, so let's lock in the vocabulary. The cost borne by society beyond what the producer or consumer pays is called the external cost, and when you add the private cost of production to the external cost, you get the social cost, the true full cost to society of producing that unit. The formula you need is social cost equals private cost plus external cost. This is not just a definition to memorize. It drives everything about how the graph works and how the market fails. The core graph, drawing it correctly. This is the graph you absolutely must be able to draw, label, and interpret on the FRQ section. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. The demand curve stays put. It represents the marginal private benefit, MPB, to consumers, and because there are no positive externalities in consumption here, it also equals the marginal social benefit, MSB. So your demand curve is doing double duty. Label it both D equals MPB equals MSB. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You draw two supply curves. The lower one is the marginal private cost, MPC. This is the supply curve that the firm actually sees and responds to. It reflects only what the producer pays: labor, materials, energy. The upper supply curve is the marginal social cost, MSC. This curve sits above MPC by the vertical distance equal to the external cost per unit. Think of it this way. If a factory pollutes the river and causes downstream communities to spend money on water filtration, that filtration cost is real. It's just not showing up on the factory's books. The MSC curve captures it. The market equilibrium, where MPC crosses demand, gives you the private market output, call it Q market, and the private price, P market. But the socially optimal output, where MSC crosses demand, gives you a lower quantity, Q optimal, at a higher price. That gap between Q market and Q optimal is the heart of the problem. Because the market ignores external costs, it produces too much of the good. This is the overproduction your section title promises. The deadweight loss triangle forms between Q optimal and Q market, bounded by the MSC above and the MSB demand below. This triangle represents the net loss to society from producing those extra units where social cost exceeds social benefit. On the FRQ, if they ask you to shade the deadweight loss, it's that triangle, and getting the orientation right is worth points. Why markets fail here? This is conceptual gold for multiple choice questions. The market fails because private decision makers have no financial incentive to account for costs they don't pay. The factory doesn't pay for the filtration systems downstream, so from their perspective, producing more is always worth it as long as their private costs are covered. This is called a market failure, the free market. Left alone, misallocates resources. In this case, it allocates too many resources to the production of goods with negative externalities. You'll want to connect this to Unit 1, where you learn that markets are efficient when all costs and benefits are internalized. When they're not, the market's invisible hand is pointing the wrong direction. Government interventions, the corrective tax. The classic solution is a Pigouvian tax, named after economist Arthur Pigou, though the College Board typically just calls it a corrective tax or per unit tax on producers. Here's the logic. If the government imposes a tax exactly equal to the external cost per unit, the producer's private cost curve shifts up by that amount. And now MPC plus tax equals MSC. The tax forces the firm to internalize the externality. The market equilibrium now occurs at Q optimal, where it should have been all along. This is one of the most elegant ideas in economics. You're not eliminating the market, you're fixing its information problem with a price signal. The exam will test whether you know the correct size of the tax. It equals the vertical distance between MPC and MSC at the optimal quantity, not at the market quantity, at the optimal quantity. That's an edge case that trips up many students. Other interventions include regulations, quantity limits, emission standards, cap and trade systems, and in some cases, tradable permits, though the Pigouvian tax is the conceptual favorite for exam questions. MCQ traps to watch for. The most dangerous trap on multiple choice questions is confusing which curve shifts. A corrective tax on producers shifts the supply curve MPC upward. It does not shift demand. Students who confuse this will pick wrong answers about price and quantity changes. Another classic trap, assuming the externality affects the demand side. If a factory smoke bothers neighbors who aren't buying the product, that's a production externality, not a consumption externality, and it affects the supply side of the graph. Keep those straight. Students also frequently confuse overproduction with a shortage. There is no shortage here. The market clears. There are willing buyers and sellers transacting at P market. The problem is that the market is clearing at the wrong quantity. Too much is being produced relative to what's socially optimal. These are fundamentally different problems, and mixing them up is a reliable way to lose points. Finally, remember that the deadweight loss from a negative externality exists without any government intervention. It's the welfare loss caused by the market failure itself. Don't confuse it with the deadweight loss, sometimes caused by a poorly calibrated tax. If a question asks about the DWL before government intervention, it exists, it's real, and it's that overproduction triangle. Connections to the broader course. This topic connects beautifully to Unit 2's elasticity concepts because the size of the overproduction problem and the effectiveness of a corrective tax both depend on the price elasticity of demand and supply. It also connects to Unit 3's analysis of firm behavior. Firms in competitive markets face price signals, and externalities break those signals. And you'll want to remember this framework when you get to public goods and common resources later in Unit 6, where similar market failure logic applies. The key takeaway: negative externalities cause overproduction. The social cost exceeds the private cost, and the corrective tax is designed to close exactly that gap. Keep your graph labels precise, know where the deadweight loss triangle sits, and you'll be in great shape. Coming up next, we flip the script entirely. Instead of costs being ignored, we look at what happens when benefits spill over to people outside the market, which leads to underproduction and an entirely new set of policy tools. 6.6 Positive externalities and underproduction. What is a positive externality? Let's start with a thought experiment. You live next door to someone who plants a gorgeous garden. Tulips, lavender, roses, the whole deal. Every morning you walk out your front door, and it just makes your day better. Did you pay for that? Nope. Did your neighbor factor in the joy they were giving you when they decided how many flowers to plant? Almost certainly not. That spillover benefit flowing to you, a third party who had no say in the transaction, is a positive externality, and it's at the heart of everything in Section 6.6. The College Board defines a positive externality as a benefit experienced by a third party who is neither the buyer nor the seller in a market transaction. You'll also hear the term external benefit used interchangeably, and you should be comfortable with both. The classic examples you'll want to have ready for the exam are vaccinations, education, R&D, and innovation, beekeeping near an orchard, and home renovation that raises the whole neighborhood's property values. Each of these involves a private transaction whose benefits spill beyond the parties making the deal. The core problem: underproduction. Here's the key insight that drives every AP question on this topic. When positive externalities exist, the free market produces too little of the good. This is called underproduction, and understanding why it happens is the conceptual engine of this entire section. Think about it this way. When a firm decides how much to produce, it only counts the costs and benefits that flow through its own ledger. It doesn't consider the benefits it's handing out to bystanders for free. So the market demand curve, which reflects only the private benefit to buyers, actually understates the total social value of the good. Society values the good more than the market price reflects, but nobody is compensating the producer for those extra benefits, so the producer doesn't respond to them. The result is that the market settles on a quantity that is lower than what would be best for society as a whole. The market outcome is inefficient, and that inefficiency has a name: deadweight loss. Drawing and interpreting the positive externality graph. This graph is one of the most important things you need to be able to draw from memory for the AP exam. Here's how to build it step by step. Start with the standard supply and demand axes: price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Draw a downward sloping demand curve, but label it MPB, which stands for marginal private benefit. This is the demand curve you already know from Unit 1, but we're being more precise now. Then draw a second downward sloping demand curve above and to the right of MPB, and label it MSB for marginal social benefit. The vertical gap between MSB and MPB at any quantity represents the marginal external benefit, MEB the spillover benefit to third parties at that unit of production. Your supply curve stays the same as normal. Label it MPC for marginal private cost, assuming there's no production externality here. MPC equals MSC, marginal social cost, where MPC crosses MPB. Mark that intersection as the market equilibrium, call it QM market quantity and PM market price, where MPC crosses MSB. Mark that intersection as the socially optimal equilibrium, call it Q optimal quantity and PM market price. Notice that QM is to the left of Q. The market is producing less than the social optimum. That gap between QM and QNs is your underproduction. The deadweight loss triangle is formed between the MPC, the MSB curve, and the vertical lines at QM and QNs. It points to the right, and it represents the value society is missing out on because those extra units between QM and QNs are never produced, even though their social benefit exceeds their cost. On the FRQ, if a scorer asks you to shade the deadweight loss, it's that triangle. Do not shade it on the wrong side of the market equilibrium. That's one of the most common errors. The formula and decision rule. The key efficiency condition you must know is this. The socially optimal quantity is where MSB equals MSC. In the case of a pure positive externality with no supply-side externality, MSC equals MPC. So you're looking for where MSB crosses the supply curve. The formula connecting the curves is MSB equals MPB plus MEB. Marginal social benefit equals marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. When you see a numerical FRQ, you may need to add the external benefit per unit to the demand schedule to derive the MSB schedule, then find where it intersects supply. Government solutions, subsidies. Because the market underproduces, government intervention aims to increase quantity toward Q. The primary policy tool here is a per-unit subsidy. The government pays either producers or consumers an amount equal to the marginal external benefit at the optimal quantity. This shifts the effective price and incentivizes more production. On your graph, a subsidy to consumers shifts MPB upward to equal MSB, closing the gap. A subsidy to producers shifts MPC downward by the same amount. Either way, the new market quantity moves to Q dot. The subsidy amount should exactly equal the MEB at Q stars. This is a critical FRQ scoring point. Common traps and edge cases. The most frequent MCQ trap is confusing the direction of the shift. Positive externalities involve a demand-side issue. The MSB curve sits above MPB. Don't confuse this with negative production externalities, where MSC sits above MPC. Another trap. Students sometimes say the market overproduces with a positive externality. Wrong, it underproduces. Overproduction belongs to negative externalities. Edge case to watch: if the external benefit is very large, Q par could be dramatically higher than QM. The graph logic is the same, you just have a bigger gap and a larger deadweight loss triangle. Also, some MCQs will give you a market that's already subsidized and ask whether the subsidy is too large or too small relative to the MEB. If the subsidy exceeds the MEB, the market will now overproduce, which creates a new deadweight loss on the other side. Connections to other units. This topic connects directly to Unit 1's supply and demand model and Unit 5's perfectly competitive markets. You're applying the same efficiency framework, but layering in social costs and benefits. It also links to Unit 6's broader theme of market failure, alongside negative externalities 6.5, public goods 6.7, and income inequality. When you see a question about whether a market is efficient, always ask yourself, are there externalities? That question is a bridge across nearly every unit in this course. With positive externalities and underproduction firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to take on the next form of market failure, public goods, where the problem of underproduction becomes even more dramatic because the market may produce none of the good at all. 6.7 Government corrections for negative externalities, taxes, regulations. The problem government is trying to solve. Let's pick up right where we left off, with negative externalities. Remember, the core issue is that when a factory pumps pollution into the air or a driver adds to traffic congestion, the cost of that harm falls on people who had no say in the transaction. The market ignores those third-party costs, which means the market overproduces the good and charges a price that's too low. Society ends up at the wrong equilibrium, more output, more damage than is socially ideal. So what can government do about it? That's exactly what this section is about, and it's one of the most heavily tested topics in all of Unit 6. The government has two broad tools in its toolkit: price-based solutions, most importantly a corrective tax, and quantity-based solutions, which include regulations like caps or outright bans. Each works differently, and the AP exam will test whether you understand not just what they do, but how they show up on a graph, and when one is preferable to the other. The corrective tax, also called a Pigouvian tax. Here's the elegant idea behind a corrective tax, sometimes called a Pigouvian tax after the economist Arthur Pigou, who first formalized it. If the market is overproducing, because firms aren't paying the full social cost of production, you simply make them pay it. You attach a tax to each unit produced that's exactly equal to the marginal external cost at the socially optimal quantity. Think of it like adding the harm back into the price tag. The factory was essentially getting a hidden subsidy from society by being allowed to pollute for free. The tax takes that subsidy away. Now here's how this plays out on your graph, and you absolutely need to be able to draw this. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. The market supply curve represents the marginal private cost, labeled MPC. Demand represents marginal private benefit, labeled MPB. Where those two cross gives you the market equilibrium, a quantity that is too high and a price that is too low from society's perspective. Now draw the marginal social cost curve, labeled MSC, above and to the left of MPC. The vertical distance between MSC and MPC at any given quantity represents the marginal external cost, or MEC. The socially optimal equilibrium is where MSC intersects MPB, giving you a lower quantity and a higher price than the market produces. Here's the key move. The corrective tax shifts the MPC curve upward by exactly the amount of the marginal external cost at the optimal quantity. When the tax is set correctly, the new MPC with tax equals the MSC, and the market now arrives at the socially optimal quantity all on its own. You don't need to command firms to produce less. You just change the price signal and let the market do the work. This is the beauty of a well-designed corrective tax. For the AP exam, remember the formula: corrective tax equals marginal external cost, MEC, at the socially optimal quantity. If an FRQ gives you numbers and asks you to identify the correct tax, you're looking for the vertical distance between MSC and MPC at Q optimal, not at the market equilibrium. What happens to welfare? Once the corrective tax is in place and output moves to Q optimal, the deadweight loss that existed before disappears. This is critical. Before the tax, there was a triangle of deadweight loss representing the units produced beyond Q optimal, where marginal social cost exceeded marginal social benefit. After the tax, that triangle is gone, and society is at the efficient outcome. The government also collects tax revenue equal to the tax per unit, multiplied by the quantity produced on your graph. That's a rectangle, bounded by the tax amount vertically and Q optimal horizontally. A common trap on the multiple choice section is to assume that taxes always reduce welfare. In the case of a corrective tax, the opposite is true. It actually restores allocative efficiency and increases total social welfare by eliminating the deadweight loss. Regulations as a direct approach. The second tool is direct regulation. Instead of changing price signals, the government just mandates an outcome. This might look like a pollution standard that says firms cannot emit more than a certain number of tons per year, a technology requirement that mandates cleaner production methods, or in extreme cases, an outright ban on a product altogether. On a graph, a regulation that limits quantity acts like a vertical line drawn at Q optimal, preventing any output to the right of that point. The effect on quantity is identical to a well-calibrated corrective tax. Both, if designed correctly, get you to the same Q optimal. However, they differ in important ways that the AP exam loves to probe. A corrective tax gives firms flexibility. They can choose how much to reduce production or invest in cleaner technology based on their own cost calculations. A regulation is a blunt instrument. It mandates the outcome regardless of each firm's individual costs. Economists generally prefer taxes for this flexibility and because they generate revenue. But regulations are faster to implement and easier to enforce when monitoring emissions is difficult. Edge cases and exam traps to watch for. Let's talk about the traps. First, students frequently confuse which curve shifts when a corrective tax is imposed. The tax shifts the supply curve specifically. It shifts MPC up. It does not shift the MSC curve or the demand curve. Second, be careful with the direction of the welfare change. A corrective tax reduces producer surplus and the quantity traded, but the deadweight loss disappears, so total social welfare rises. Don't confuse a reduction in market surplus with a reduction in social welfare. They're measuring different things. Third, watch out for questions asking about an overcorrected tax, a tax set higher than the MEC. In that case, the market underproduces relative to the social optimum, and a new, smaller deadweight loss emerges on the left side of Q optimal. The tax has overcorrected. This is a real MCQ scenario. This topic also connects beautifully to Unit 2's supply and demand mechanics, Unit 4's factor markets where pollution affects labor conditions, and Unit 5's production cost analysis. It also directly mirrors the positive externality side you'll see with subsidies. The logic is symmetrical, just flipped, and keeping that symmetry in your head will help you navigate the entire externalities family of questions. Connecting forward. Now that you understand how government corrects for negative externalities through taxes and regulations, we're ready to flip the picture entirely, because sometimes markets don't produce enough of a good, not too much, and that calls for a completely different set of government tools. Next, we'll tackle how subsidies and public provision can correct for positive externalities. 6.8 Government Corrections for Positive Externalities, Subsidies, Public Provision. The problem we're solving. Let's pick up right where the story of externalities left off. You now know that when a market activity creates spillover benefits for third parties, people who aren't buying or selling in that market, we call that a positive externality. Education, vaccines, public parks, basic research, these are all classic examples. The person getting a flu shot benefits, sure, but so does everyone around them who is now less likely to get sick. The problem, as you'll remember, is that private markets tend to undervalue those spillover benefits. Because consumers only count their own private benefit when deciding how much to buy, the market settles at an output level that is too low from society's point of view. The market fails. And today we're talking about how government steps in to fix that. The core graph. And you must be able to draw this. Here's the graph you absolutely need to master. Start with a standard supply and demand diagram. Your horizontal axis is quantity, your vertical axis is price. Draw a downward sloping demand curve. Label it D equals MPB for marginal private benefit, because that curve reflects only what individual consumers are willing to pay. Now draw a second demand curve above and to the right of the first one. Label it MSB for marginal social benefit. The vertical gap between MPB and MSB at any given quantity is the value of the external benefit, sometimes called the per unit subsidy amount. Your supply curve, label it S equals MPC equals MSC, represents marginal private cost. And in the case of positive externalities, we assume no supply-side externality, so marginal social cost equals marginal private cost. The supply curve stays put. Where does the market equilibrate? At the intersection of MPB and supply, that gives you the market equilibrium quantity and price. Label that point Q market. Now, the socially optimal output is where MSB intersects supply. Label that Q optimal. Notice that Q optimal is greater than Q market. This is the deadweight loss triangle that represents the underproduction. The units of the good that should be produced because their social benefit exceeds their social cost, but the private market fails to produce them. This deadweight loss triangle sits between Q market and Q optimal, bounded above by the MSB curve and below by the supply curve. Draw that triangle, shade it, and label it DWL. College Board loves asking you to identify this on an FRQ. How a subsidy corrects the underproduction. Now, how does the government fix this? The most elegant tool is a per-unit subsidy to consumers, sometimes called a Pigouvian subsidy, named after the same economist who gave us the Pigouvian tax you studied for negative externalities. The idea is beautifully simple. If the market is undervaluing the spillover benefits, government pays consumers an amount equal to the per-unit external benefit, effectively shifting their demand curve upward. If the per-unit external benefit is, say, $10, the government writes a $10 subsidy into the market. The MPB curve shifts upward by exactly that amount, and now it coincides with the MSB curve. The new market equilibrium occurs at Q optimal. The deadweight loss disappears. The market now produces the socially optimal quantity. On your graph, show the subsidy as the vertical distance between the original MPB and the MSB. That's the dollar amount of the subsidy. After the subsidy, consumers pay a lower effective price. Producers receive a higher effective price, and output rises to the socially efficient level. The key formula to remember: the optimal subsidy equals the per unit external benefit, which equals the vertical distance between MSB and MPB at the socially optimal quantity. Alternatively, the government might instead offer the subsidy to producers, a per unit subsidy that shifts the supply curve downward since it reduces producers' effective costs. Either way, the goal is identical: close the gap between private and social benefit and push output toward Q optimal. Public provision. The government just does it. The second major correction mechanism is public provision, and this is conceptually distinct from a subsidy. Here, instead of nudging the private market, government simply produces the good itself and provides it free or below cost to society. Think of public schools, public libraries, national defense research, and public health vaccination campaigns. The logic is that if the private market is producing far too little of something with enormous social benefits, it may be more efficient for government to just take over production entirely, funding it through tax revenue. Public provision is particularly common when a good also has characteristics of a public good, which connects this section directly back to Unit 6's discussion of non-excludable, non-rival goods. When you see national defense or basic scientific research on an exam question, connect the dots. These goods have positive externalities and public good properties, making private provision virtually impossible and public provision essentially mandatory. Common MCQ traps. Don't fall for these. There are several traps that trip up students on multiple choice every single year. First, remember the direction of the shift. A consumer subsidy shifts the demand curve upward, not the supply curve. If an FRQ asks you to show the effect of a subsidy to consumers, your supply curve does not move. Second, don't confuse the deadweight loss triangle with the consumer or producer surplus rectangles. The DWL sits between the market output and optimal output, specifically in that triangle shape we described. Third, be precise about who receives the subsidy in a given problem. A subsidy to producers shifts supply downward, while a subsidy to consumers shifts demand upward. The end result on output is the same, but the graph looks different, and FRQ graders check this. Fourth, the optimal subsidy is always equal to the per unit external benefit, not the total benefit, a very common calculation error. Connecting this to the rest of the course. This topic connects powerfully to several others. In Unit 6, it mirrors the Pigouvian tax correction for negative externalities. Same logic, opposite direction. It also ties directly to your Unit 1 understanding of consumer and producer surplus, since you're essentially analyzing welfare changes on the same supply-demand diagram. And when you think about who bears the cost of a subsidy, taxpayers, you're touching on Unit 1 and Unit 2 ideas about government budget constraints and opportunity costs. On the FRQ, don't be surprised if a question asks you first to identify the underproduction, then draw the corrective subsidy, then calculate the dollar value of the subsidy given specific numbers, all three skills tested in sequence. With government corrections for positive externalities now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all, public goods and common resources, where the market doesn't just underproduce, it often fails to produce at all. 6.9 Coase theorem and private solutions to externalities. The big idea. What if the market could fix itself? So far in Unit 6, we've talked a lot about how externalities cause market failure, how the invisible hand can't quite reach far enough to account for costs and benefits that spill over onto third parties. The natural follow-up question is, does the government always have to step in? And here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer, under the right conditions, is no. Enter Ronald Coase, a Nobel Prize-winning economist who argued in 1960 that private parties can sometimes negotiate their way to the socially efficient outcome all on their own. No taxes, no subsidies, no government bureaucracy required. The Coase theorem states that if property rights are clearly defined and transaction costs are negligible, private bargaining between affected parties will lead to the socially efficient outcome regardless of who initially holds the property rights. Read that again slowly, because every single word matters for the AP exam. Unpacking the two core conditions. Think of the Coase theorem as a recipe. You need exactly two ingredients to make it work. The first is clearly defined property rights. Someone has to legally own the right to either pollute or to enjoy clean air. It doesn't matter who has that right, just that someone has it. The second ingredient is negligible transaction costs, the cost of negotiating, finding each other, writing the contract, and enforcing the agreement has to be so small that it doesn't eat up the gains from the deal. In a coffee shop between two neighbors, that's easy. Across thousands of strangers, not so much. Here's the classic analogy. Imagine you have a neighbor who barbecues every Sunday, and the smoke drifts into your open windows while you're trying to work from home. That smoke is a negative externality. Now, suppose the law gives your neighbor the right to barbecue. You could approach her and say, look, that smoke costs me about $50 worth of productivity every Sunday. I'll pay you $40 to stop. If stopping only costs her, say, $20 in lost enjoyment, she'll take that deal. You're both better off, and the externality is internalized, not by government, but by the two of you at the backyard fence. Coase's radical insight was that even if the law were flipped, giving you the right to clean air, the efficient outcome would still emerge, just with the money flowing in the opposite direction. The efficiency of the final outcome is the same. Only the distribution of wealth changes. What the Coase theorem means for graphs. Here's where AP exam precision really matters. When private bargaining succeeds under Coase conditions, the market outcome moves from the privately optimal quantity to the socially optimal quantity, which is the output level where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. On a standard negative externality graph, that means production moves leftward from where supply MPC intersects demand MPB to where the MSC curve intersects MPB. The deadweight loss triangle that represented market failure disappears entirely. The graph ends up looking exactly like what you'd draw after a perfectly calibrated Pigouvian tax, because in both cases, you've achieved the socially efficient outcome. The mechanism is different, but the result on the graph is identical. Examiners love testing whether you understand this equivalence. Common MCQ traps you must avoid. The biggest trap on multiple choice questions is the claim that the Coase theorem says property rights don't matter at all. That's too strong. They matter enormously for who ends up with the money for the distribution of the gains. What doesn't change is the quantity of the externality generating activity at the new equilibrium. If you see an answer choice saying the Coase theorem implies that property rights are irrelevant, that's wrong. The correct phrasing is that efficiency is independent of the initial assignment of property rights. As long as the two conditions hold, the second trap is assuming the Coase theorem applies broadly in the real world. Coase himself was clear that the whole point of his paper was to explain why government intervention is often necessary, because transaction costs are almost always positive in practice. When the externality involves many parties, like a factory polluting a river used by thousands of downstream residents, getting all those people to coordinate a negotiation is wildly expensive. Transaction costs explode, the deal falls apart, and you're right back to market failure requiring a policy response. Expect MCQs that give you a scenario with many affected parties and ask whether Coase bargaining is likely to succeed. The answer will almost always be no. Other private solutions, the AP exam tests. Beyond Coase bargaining, College Board wants you to recognize a few other private solutions to externalities. Social norms and moral codes can internalize externalities informally. Think of the social pressure not to litter, which imposes a reputational cost even without legal enforcement. Charitable organizations and nonprofits can address positive externality under provision. Public radio stations, for instance, exist partly because the market undersupplies broadcasting with positive spillovers. Mergers and vertical integration are a subtler example. If a polluting factory and a downstream fishery are owned by the same company, the owner now bears both the cost of producing and the cost of the pollution, effectively internalizing the externality through ownership structure rather than negotiation. This last one is a favorite FRQ curveball. Be ready to explain why a merger could solve an externality problem. Connections to other units. The Coase theorem sits at the intersection of several AP micro concepts you've already mastered. It connects directly to the Unit 1 concept of property rights as a foundational institution for markets to function. It reinforces Unit 6's broader framework of externalities and the divergence between private and social costs and benefit. And it connects forward to the policy comparison the exam often sets up. When should a government use a Pigouvian tax or subsidy versus relying on private bargaining? The answer hinges on those two Coase conditions. If they're met, bargaining works. If they're not, you need the policy tools from Section 6.8. For FRQ scoring, if a question asks you to explain why a cohesion solution might fail, you must explicitly identify which condition is violated. Either property rights are unclear or transaction costs are prohibitively high. And explain the mechanism. Vague answers like, it's too complicated, won't earn points. Name the condition, explain why it's violated, and connect it to why the efficient outcome won't be reached. As we move forward, you'll see that when private solutions fall short, governments reach for a powerful toolkit of taxes, subsidies, regulations, and public provision, each one designed to close the gap between private incentives and social welfare, which is exactly where we're headed next. 6.10 Public Goods, Non-Excludable and Non-Rival Characteristics. What makes a good public? Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're sitting in a park on a clear summer night watching a fireworks display. The show is spectacular. Brilliant bursts of color lighting up the sky above thousands of spectators. Now, here's the question. Can the fireworks company prevent you from watching, even if you didn't buy a ticket? And does your enjoyment of that fireworks display somehow diminish your neighbor's enjoyment? The answer to both questions is no. And that simple observation is the entire foundation of public goods theory in AP Microeconomics. A public good, as College Board defines it, has two essential characteristics that you must be able to recite and apply. It is non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. Get those two terms locked into your memory because the AP exam will test your ability to classify goods using exactly that language. Non-excludable means that once the good is provided, you cannot feasibly prevent anyone from consuming it. There's no bouncer at the door, no paywall, no fence. National defense is the textbook example. When the U.S. military protects the country, it protects everyone within its borders simultaneously, including people who haven't paid a single dollar in taxes. You simply cannot exclude a free rider from receiving that protection. Non-rival means that one person's consumption of the good does not reduce the amount available for others. Think about that fireworks display again. When you use it by watching it, you haven't consumed any of it in a way that leaves less for the person standing next to you. Compare that to a slice of pizza. If you eat it, it's gone. Pizza is rival. Fireworks are not. The free rider problem and market failure. Here's where the economics gets really interesting, and where this connects directly to market failure, the core theme of Unit 6. Because public goods are non-excludable, rational individuals have every incentive to let someone else pay for them while they enjoy the benefits for free. This is the free rider problem, and it's the reason private markets systematically underprovide public goods. Think about it from a firm's perspective. If you were a private company thinking about providing national defense or clean air, you'd face an immediate problem. How do you charge customers when you can't prevent non-payers from benefiting? You can't. So the profit motive evaporates. No firm can capture enough revenue to make provision worthwhile, and the market produces either 0 units or a quantity far below what is socially optimal. This is a textbook case of market failure. The market left to itself produces an inefficient outcome, specifically one where the good is underprovided relative to the social optimum. This is the justification for government provision. Because private markets fail here, the government steps in, produces the public good, and finances it through taxation. That's a direct connection to your earlier units on market failure, externalities, and government intervention. Just as the government uses Pigouvian taxes to correct negative externalities, it uses public provision and taxation to correct the underprovision of public goods. The 4-category framework. Know this cold. For the AP exam, you need to master the 2x2 classification grid that College Board uses to categorize all goods. Goods are either excludable or non-excludable, and either rival or non-rival, giving you 4 categories. Private goods are both excludable and rival, a sandwich, a car, a pair of shoes. Public goods are both non-excludable and non-rival, national defense, broadcast television signals, lighthouse beams, street lighting. Common resources are non-excludable but rival. Fish in the open ocean, clean groundwater, congested public roads, and artificially scarce goods, sometimes called club goods, are excludable but non-rival, a streaming service like Netflix, a toll road with spare capacity, a private club with empty seats. The AP exam loves to test your ability to classify goods correctly, and the most common trap is confusing public goods with goods that are simply provided by the government. The post office is government-run, but it is excludable and rival. It's actually a private good by these definitions. Public schools are excludable. You need to be enrolled, and somewhat rival. Class sizes matter. Government provision does not automatically make something a public good. The classification depends entirely on the 2 characteristics, excludability and rivalry, not on who provides it. Common resources and the tragedy of the commons. A closely related concept that appears frequently alongside public goods is the tragedy of the commons, which applies to common resources. Because common resources are non-excludable, individuals have no incentive to conserve them. Each person rationally uses as much as possible, leading to overuse and eventual depletion. Overfishing is the classic example. This is the mirror image of the public goods problem. Public goods are underprovided because no one wants to pay. Common resources are overconsumed because no one wants to conserve. Both are market failures arising from the non-excludability characteristic. Graphs and the social optimum. Unlike most market failures in this unit, public goods don't have a single signature graph the way negative externalities have the deadweight loss triangle. However, you should understand conceptually that the efficient quantity of a public good requires aggregating demand differently than for private goods. For private goods, you add quantities horizontally at each price to get market demand. For public goods, because everyone consumes the same unit simultaneously, you add the marginal benefits vertically. You sum up what each individual would be willing to pay for that same unit. The socially optimal quantity is where this summed marginal benefit equals the marginal cost of provision. The AP exam rarely asks you to calculate this numerically, but you may see a conceptual question about why public good demand curves are summed vertically rather than horizontally. Edge cases and exam traps to watch for. 2 boundary cases consistently trip up students. First, the internet and broadcast radio. A broadcast signal over the air is non-excludable and non-rival, classic public good. But cable television or a password-protected streaming service is excludable. That makes it a club good, not a public good. Second, Roads. An uncongested road is non-rival, but a congested road becomes rival as additional drivers slow everyone else down. The AP exam may present a scenario where you need to identify whether a road in a given context is a public good or a common resource. The answer depends on whether it's congested. Also, watch out for questions that ask why the free rider problem causes market failure. The correct AP answer is that because firms cannot exclude free riders, they cannot charge a price that covers costs. So, private markets underprovide the good, not that the good is somehow harmful or that people are behaving illegally. Free riding is individually rational behavior. The market failure is the systemic result. Connecting it all together. Public goods theory ties together nearly everything in Unit 6. The free rider problem is a form of market failure just like negative externalities and imperfect information. The remedy, government provision funded by taxes, connects directly to Unit 6's broader argument that government intervention can improve efficiency when markets fail. And the classification framework you've just learned will appear in market structure questions, environmental economics scenarios, and even in discussions of healthcare and education later in the course. Now that you've got public goods mastered, we're going to turn to another critical source of market failure, imperfect information, where buyers and sellers don't have the same knowledge, and how that asymmetry distorts market outcomes in ways that once again call for a policy response. 6.11 Free Rider Problem. What is the free rider problem? Imagine it's finals week in a college dorm, and someone decides to buy a giant pizza and leave it in the common room for everyone to share. The pizza is there, warm, glorious, free for the taking, and every single person on that floor gets to eat it, whether they chipped in $1 or not. The students who didn't pay, they're free riders? They got the benefit without bearing any of the cost. Now, here's the deeper problem. If everyone on that floor expects someone else to buy the pizza, nobody buys it. The pizza never appears. That's the free rider problem in a nutshell, and it's one of the most important concepts in Unit 6 of AP Microeconomics. The free rider problem arises specifically because of a particular type of good, a public good. To understand the free rider problem, you absolutely must internalize the two defining characteristics of public goods. They are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. Non-excludable means you cannot prevent anyone from using the good once it's provided. There's no practical way to keep someone out. Non-rival means one person's use of the good does not diminish the amount available to anyone else. National defense is the classic AP exam example. When the military protects U.S. soil, it protects every resident simultaneously. And the fact that it's protecting you doesn't reduce the protection available to your neighbor. Both characteristics must be present for a good to be a public good, and the free rider problem flows directly from non-excludability. Why markets fail to provide public goods. Here's where this connects to the broader theme of Unit 6, market failure. When a good is non-excludable, private firms face a devastating incentive problem. Think about it from the producer's perspective. If you can't charge people for using your product because you can't stop them from using it, whether they pay or not, rational consumers will simply wait for someone else to provide it and then enjoy it for free. This is the free rider problem, creating what economists call the underprovision of public goods. The market, left entirely to itself, will produce a quantity of public goods that is far below the socially optimal level, and in many cases it will produce zero. This is why the government steps in. Government can fund public goods through taxation, compelling everyone to contribute, and then provide the good to all citizens. National defense, public fireworks displays, lighthouses, street lighting, and basic scientific research are all textbook examples. The AP exam loves to ask you to identify whether a given good is a public good, so drill this. If it's non-excludable and non-rival, it's a public good, and the free rider problem is the mechanism that causes market failure. The graph you need to know. The AP exam will expect you to work with the concept of social optimal output versus market output for public goods. Picture a standard supply and demand graph, but with a twist for public goods. The relevant concept is the sum of individual marginal willingness to pay, which you find by adding marginal benefit curves vertically rather than horizontally. Why vertically? Because when a good is non-rival, multiple people consume the same unit simultaneously. So the total social benefit of that one unit is the sum of what every individual is willing to pay for it. In contrast, for a private good, you add demand curves horizontally because each unit goes to only one person. On your graph, draw a downward-sloping marginal social benefit curve, which is that vertically summed curve, and a marginal cost curve. Where they intersect is the socially optimal quantity. Call it Q, then draw the market output, which hugs close to zero or significantly below Q star because of the free rider problem. The wedge between market output and Q star is the area of deadweight loss, representing the welfare society loses because the market underprovides the good. Be ready to label Q the deadweight loss triangle and the socially optimal price on this graph because FRQ scoring rubrics reward precise labeling. Edge cases and common MCQ traps. This is where students lose points, so pay close attention. The most common trap is confusing public goods with goods provided by the government. These are not the same thing. The government provides many goods that are actually private goods, like parking spaces in a government lot or rides on a toll road. A good is a public good based on its economic characteristics, not based on who provides it. If the AP exam describes a government-provided good that is excludable or rival, it is not a public good. The second major trap involves common resources. Common resources are non-excludable, but rival in consumption. Think of a shared fishing lake or an open-range pasture. They're easy to confuse with public goods because they share the non-excludable trait, but they differ critically because consumption by one person reduces availability for others. Common resources suffer from the tragedy of the commons, not the free rider problem, though both involve overuse or underprovision stemming from non-excludability. Know the 2x2 matrix: excludable, non-excludable on one axis, rival, non-rival on the other. Public goods sit in the non-excludable, non-rival corner. A third trap: students sometimes think the free rider problem means the good is never provided. It means the market provides less than the optimal amount, often zero in theory, but not always in reality. Voluntary provision, charitable contributions, and private clubs can sometimes provide quasi-public goods. The AP exam might describe a scenario where a good is partially provided privately and ask whether a free rider problem still exists. The answer is yes, as long as non-excludability prevents full cost recovery. Connections to other units. The free rider problem doesn't exist in isolation on the AP exam. It threads through several other topics. It connects directly to externalities from earlier in Unit 6. Both represent situations where private market decisions diverge from socially optimal outcomes, requiring government intervention. When you discuss positive externalities, you talk about marginal social benefit exceeding marginal private benefit, and public goods take this to the extreme, where the good essentially generates benefits for the entire society simultaneously. The concept also connects to government intervention and taxation as corrective tools, and it provides the economic rationale for why certain forms of government spending exist in the first place, a topic that bridges nicely into macroeconomics when you study fiscal policy in Unit 5 of AP Macro. Understanding the free rider problem also reinforces your grasp of the efficiency concept from earlier units. Markets are efficient when they maximize total surplus, but free riding systematically destroys surplus by preventing mutually beneficial provision of goods. Every time you see a deadweight loss triangle, remember it represents real human welfare that's simply gone. With the free rider problem firmly in your toolkit, you're now ready to look at how governments attempt to correct these market failures through specific policy mechanisms, and that's exactly where we're headed next. 6.12 Common Resources and the Tragedy of the Commons. Let's talk about something that connects ancient fishing villages, modern overfishing crises, and almost certainly a parking lot near you. We're diving into common resources and the tragedy of the commons, one of the most elegant and devastating ideas in all of economics, and a concept the College Board loves to test because it sits right at the intersection of individual rationality and collective disaster. What is a common resource? Start with the definition because precision matters on the AP exam. A common resource is a good that is rival in consumption but non-excludable. Let's unpack that. Rival means that one person's use of the good diminishes the amount available for others. If I catch a fish, you can't catch that same fish. Non-excludable means you can't reasonably prevent people from using it. You can't build a fence around the ocean. This combination is what makes common resources so uniquely problematic, and it's also what distinguishes them from the other three goods in the four-good classification system you need to know cold for this exam. Your four types are private goods, rival and excludable, your sandwich; public goods, non-rival and non-excludable, national defense; club goods, also called artificially scarce goods, non-rival but excludable, a streaming service; and common resources, rival but non-excludable. College Board will absolutely give you a good and ask you to classify it, so make sure you're running through both dimensions. Can people be prevented from using it? Does one person's use reduce what's available to others? Answer both questions and you'll never misclassify a good. Real-world examples of common resources that appear in AP contexts include ocean fisheries, groundwater aquifers, public grazing land, clean air, and congested highways. Notice the word congested there. That's important. An uncongested highway is actually closer to a public good because your use doesn't reduce mine. But once it's congested, it becomes rival, which is why traffic economists treat congested roads as a common resource problem. That's a nuance that shows up in tricky MCQs. The tragedy of the commons. Now for the main event. The tragedy of the commons, a concept formalized by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968, describes what happens when individual incentives lead to the collective destruction of a shared resource. Here's the story. Imagine a village green where every farmer can graze their cattle. Each individual farmer thinks, if I add one more cow, I get the full benefit of that cow's milk and meat, but the cost of overgrazing is spread across all the farmers. Every single farmer runs the same calculation. Every farmer adds more cattle. The commons gets overgrazed and eventually destroyed. Nobody wanted that outcome, but the rational pursuit of individual self-interest produced it anyway. This is the core economic insight, because no one owns the common resource, no one has the incentive to conserve it. The private marginal benefit of using the resource accrues to the individual, but the private marginal cost ignores the external cost imposed on everyone else. Sound familiar? It should. This is a negative externality problem, and it's crucial that you see the connection. The tragedy of the commons is essentially a special case of negative externalities, where the externality arises from overuse of a shared resource. When you're writing an FRQ about this, explicitly naming that connection will earn you points. The graph, you must know. Here's how to draw and interpret the key diagram. Draw a standard market diagram with quantity of the common resource being consumed on the horizontal axis and cost or benefit on the vertical axis. Draw a downward-sloping marginal social benefit curve. That's your demand curve. Now draw two supply-side curves. The first is the marginal private cost curve, which sits lower, reflecting what individual users actually pay. The second is the marginal social cost curve, which sits above the marginal private cost curve. The vertical distance between them represents the negative externality, the external cost of overuse that each individual ignores. The market equilibrium, where individuals actually consume, is at the intersection of marginal social benefit and marginal private cost. This gives you the overconsumption quantity. The socially optimal quantity is at the intersection of marginal social benefit and marginal social cost, which is lower. The deadweight loss triangle sits between these two quantities, bounded above by the marginal social cost curve and below by the marginal social benefit curve. Label all of this carefully on an FRQ. College Board rubrics explicitly reward correctly labeled axes, correctly positioned curves, and correctly identified equilibria. Solutions to the tragedy of the commons. The AP exam expects you to know the major remedies and evaluate their trade-offs. The first approach is government regulation, quotas, fishing licenses, catch limits. These directly restrict quantity toward the social optimum. The second is Pigouvian taxes, taxing the use of the common resource to internalize the externality, shifting the marginal private cost curve up until it coincides with the marginal social cost curve. The third approach, associated with Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, is community-based management, where local users create and enforce their own rules for sustainable use. Ostrom's work is worth knowing because it challenged the idea that only privatization or government control could solve commons problems. Finally, privatization itself, converting the common resource into private property, gives owners the incentive to manage it sustainably because they now capture both the benefits and the costs of their choices. Traps and edge cases. Here's where students lose points. First, don't confuse a common resource with a public good just because both are non-excludable. The rivalry dimension is what separates them, and it determines whether overuse is even possible. Second, watch for questions about whether a resource is currently experiencing the tragedy or merely has the potential for it. A lightly used fishing ground hasn't yet experienced overuse, but it has the structure that makes the tragedy possible. Third, some MCQ questions will present a solution and ask whether it resolves the tragedy. Remember that regulation and taxes solve the overuse problem at the margin, but don't necessarily convert the good into a private good. Fourth, be precise when discussing whether a tax fully corrects the market failure. Only a Pigouvian tax set exactly equal to the marginal external cost at the social optimum achieves full internalization. Connections across units. This topic connects deeply to Unit 4's externalities framework, Unit 6's broader market failure themes, and the public goods discussion you covered in 6.11. Whenever you see overuse, overfishing, overpollution, or congestion in an AP question, your brain should immediately run through the common resource checklist. Rival? Non-excludable? Individual incentive to overuse? External cost ignored? That pattern recognition is worth points. With common resources fully in your toolkit, you're ready to bring together everything from Unit 6 into a complete picture of why markets sometimes fail and what policymakers can do about it, which is exactly where we're headed next. 6.13 Graphing externalities, marginal social cost, marginal social benefit, and deadweight loss. The big picture when markets get it wrong. Imagine your neighbor decides to host a bonfire every single night, filling the neighborhood with smoke. He's perfectly happy. He's getting warmth and entertainment at whatever cost he pays for the firewood. But you're miserable. Your laundry smells, and half the block is reaching for their inhalers. Your neighbor's private calculation completely ignores the cost he's imposing on everyone else. That, in a nutshell, is a negative externality, and it's the engine behind one of the most graph-heavy, exam-heavy topics in all of AP Microeconomics. In this section, you're going to learn exactly how to draw, label, and interpret the externality graphs that show up on virtually every AP exam. The College Board loves these graphs because they test whether you truly understand the gap between what's privately optimal and what's socially optimal, and that gap is where all the action happens. The core framework, MSC, MSB, MPC, and MPB. Let's build the vocabulary precisely, because the exam is unforgiving about terminology. Marginal private cost, MPC, is the cost borne directly by the producer for one additional unit, what it costs the factory to make one more widget. Marginal social cost, MSC, is MPC plus any external costs imposed on third parties. Think of it as the full cost to society. Similarly, marginal private benefit, MPB, is the benefit the consumer personally receives from one more unit. And marginal social benefit, MSB, is MPB plus any external benefits that spill over to third parties. The key formula relationship you must internalize. Max MSC equals MPC plus marginal external cost, MEC, and MSB equals MPB plus marginal external benefit, MEB. In a world of no externalities, MSC equals MPC and MSB equals MPB, the private and social lines overlap, and the market produces the socially optimal quantity. Externalities are precisely what drive a wedge between those lines. Graphing a negative externality, overproduction. Let's draw the negative externality graph step by step because you will absolutely be asked to either draw this or interpret it on your exam. Start with a standard supply and demand diagram. Your horizontal axis is quantity. Your vertical axis is price, dollars per unit. The demand curve here represents the marginal private benefit. Label it MPB or simply D. The supply curve represents the marginal private cost. Label it MPC or simply F. Now, because there's a negative externality, pollution from a factory, for example, the true cost to society is higher than what the producer pays. So you draw a second supply curve above and to the left of MPC. This is your MSC curve. For AP purposes, treat the vertical gap between MPC and MSC as the constant marginal external cost per unit. The market equilibrium is where MPC intersects MPB. Call that quantity QM and price PM. The socially optimal equilibrium is where MSC intersects MSB, which equals MPB here, since there's no external benefit. Call that quantity QN price and price P. Here's the critical insight the exam tests over and over. QM is greater than QNT, meaning the market overproduces relative to the social optimum. The market produces too much of the bad externality good because producers don't account for the harm they're imposing on others. This is the defining feature of a negative externality. The deadweight loss triangle is the area between the MSC and MPB curves, from Q to QM. Geometrically, it's a triangle with its tip at QN, its base running from the MSC curve down to the MPB curve at QM. This area represents the net loss to society. The units produced between QN and QM cost society more, per the MSC, than they're worth to consumers, per the MPB. On the FRQ, if you're asked to shade the DWL, shade that triangle and label it clearly. Graphing a positive externality, underproduction. Now flip the scenario. Imagine you get a flu shot. You're protected, that's your private benefit. But so is everyone around you who won't catch the flu from you. That spillover benefit to others is the marginal external benefit, and it means MSB is above MPB. For a positive externality graph, your demand curve is still MPB. But now draw a second demand curve above and to the right of MPB. That's your MMSB curve. Supply remains MPC, no external costs here. The market equilibrium QM is where MPC meets MPB. The socially optimal quantity QIRs is where MPC meets MSB. Now Q is greater than QM, the market underproduces relative to the social optimum. Society would benefit from more of this good. But the market doesn't provide it because private buyers only pay for their own benefit, not the benefit they give to others. The deadweight loss triangle here sits between the MSB and MPC curves from QM to Q shade, that triangle on your graph, tip at QM, basic Q. The most common exam traps. The number one trap on MCQs is shifting the wrong curve. Students see negative externality in production and panic, sometimes shifting the demand curve. Don't do it. A negative externality in production shifts the MSC above MPC. It's a cost side story. A positive externality in consumption, like flu shots, shifts the MSB above MPB. It's a benefit side story. Always ask yourself, is this externality on the production side or the consumption side? The second trap is mislabeling the deadweight loss direction. For negative externalities, DWL is to the right of Q. For positive externalities, DWL is to the right of QM. Both triangles point toward the market equilibrium, but they're on different sides. A reliable mental check. DWL always lives in the gap between QM and Q and between the two equilibria. A third trap, confusing the tax solution for negative externalities with the subsidy solution for positive externalities. A Pigouvian tax on a negative externality shifts MPC up to meet MSC, correcting overproduction. A Pigouvian subsidy on a positive externality shifts MPB up to meet MSB, correcting underproduction. The corrective amount equals the marginal external cost or benefit at the socially optimal quantity, that vertical distance between the private and social curves at Q. Connecting to the rest of the course. This graph is the visual backbone of everything else in Unit 6. When you study government interventions, taxes, subsidies, regulations, and tradable permits, you're essentially asking how to close the gap between QM and Q-top. The deadweight loss you shade here directly mirrors the DWL triangles you drew back in Unit 2 when studying price ceilings and floors, reinforcing that any deviation from the efficient quantity creates a welfare loss. And when you encounter public goods and common resources later in the unit, you'll recognize the same underlying logic. Private incentives diverge from social welfare. With the geometry of externality graphs firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to take the next step and explore the specific policy tools governments use to actually correct these market failures. 6.14 per unit tax and subsidy calculations and their effect on equilibrium. The government steps in. Taxes, subsidies, and market equilibrium. Picture this. You're at your favorite coffee shop and the government suddenly announces a 50-cent tax on every cup of coffee sold. Who pays that tax? You, the customer, or the barista's employer? If your instinct is, the business pays it, obviously, they're the ones writing the check to the IRS, you're thinking like most people do. And you'd be wrong. That's exactly the kind of misconception the AP exam loves to exploit, and by the end of this section, you'll never fall for it again. Let's build this up from the ground up. What is a per-unit tax? A per-unit tax, sometimes called an excise tax, is a fixed dollar amount imposed on each unit of a good that is produced or sold. Think of the federal gasoline tax, cigarette taxes, or alcohol taxes. The government levies the tax either on the seller or the buyer, and the College Board will test whether you understand that who legally pays the tax is completely separate from who economically bears the burden of the tax. That distinction is called tax incidence, and it's one of the most heavily tested ideas in this entire unit. Here's the core insight. The economic burden of a per-unit tax is shared between buyers and sellers based on the relative elasticities of supply and demand, not based on who writes the check to the government. Drawing the tax graph, your step-by-step roadmap. Start with a standard supply and demand diagram. Label your original equilibrium price P sub E and quantity Q sub E. Now, when a per-unit tax of, say, $2 is imposed on sellers, here's what happens mechanically. At every quantity, sellers now need to receive $2 more than before just to be willing to supply the same amount. That means the supply curve shifts upward by exactly the amount of the tax. The new supply curve is parallel to the old one, displaced vertically by the tax amount. Your new equilibrium is where this new supply curve crosses the original demand curve. Mark that new quantity as Q sub T. It will be less than Q sub E because the tax has made production more costly and reduced market output. Now, here's where students make their first major mistake on the exam. There are actually two important prices after the tax, not one. The price buyers pay is P sub B, which is the new equilibrium price read off the vertical axis, higher than the original price. The price sellers receive is P sub S, which is P sub B minus the tax. That gap between P sub B and P sub S equals the per unit tax exactly. Make sure you label both on your graph. The College Board FRQ rubric will explicitly award separate points for correctly identifying both the buyer's price and the seller's price. If the tax is imposed on buyers instead of sellers, the demand curve shifts downward by the tax amount. Conceptually, buyers are willing to pay less to sellers at every quantity because part of what they pay goes to the government. The math works out identically. You get the same new quantity, the same buyer price, and the same seller price. This is a critical AP exam fact. The economic outcome is the same regardless of who the tax is legally collected from. If an MCQ tells you a tax is placed on buyers instead of sellers and asks whether that changes the result, the answer is no. The burden formula, calculating incidence. Here's where the calculation piece comes in, and the College Board loves to ask this in both MCQs and FRQs. The burden borne by buyers is the increase in the price they pay, P sub B minus P sub E. The burden borne by sellers is the decrease in the price they receive, P sub E minus P sub S. Those two amounts add up to the full per unit tax. If the original equilibrium price was $10, the tax is $2. The buyer now pays $10.80 and the seller now receives $8.80. Buyers bear 80 cents of burden and sellers bear $1.20. Always verify your arithmetic sums to the tax amount. That's a built-in check. Who bears more of the burden? The side of the market that is less elastic bears more. Think of it intuitively. If buyers have very inelastic demand, like cigarette smokers who must have their product, sellers can pass most of the tax burden onto them because buyers won't walk away. If sellers have perfectly elastic supply, sellers bear none of the burden at all. These edge cases appear frequently on MCQs. In the extreme case of perfectly inelastic demand, buyers bear the entire tax. In the extreme case of perfectly elastic supply, buyers also bear the entire tax. In the extreme case of perfectly elastic demand, sellers bear the entire tax. Memorize these boundary conditions. Deadweight loss, the hidden cost of taxes. Every per unit tax creates a deadweight loss, a reduction in total surplus that represents transactions that would have been mutually beneficial but no longer occur because the tax drove a wedge between the buyer's price and the seller's price. On your graph, deadweight loss appears as a triangle between the old supply curve, the demand curve, and the vertical line at the new quantity Q sub T. This concept connects directly back to your Unit 2 work on consumer and producer surplus, and it connects forward to the market failure discussion. Taxes designed to correct negative externalities deliberately create this deadweight loss in the private market, which is the point, because it offsets the external cost being imposed on society. Subsidies. The mirror image. A per unit subsidy is the mirror image of a tax, and you should treat it that way on the exam. A subsidy of $2 per unit given to sellers shifts the supply curve downward by $2. Sellers are willing to accept $2 less from buyers because the government makes up the difference. Output increases beyond Q sub E. Buyers pay less than the original price, and sellers receive more than the original price. The per unit subsidy equals P sub S, received by sellers, minus P sub B, paid by buyers. Subsidies create a deadweight loss too. They encourage transactions that cost society more than the value buyers receive. The FRQ rubric will ask you to show consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government expenditure on the subsidy graph, so practice labeling all three areas. Connections and exam traps to remember. This topic connects tightly to Unit 4 externalities. A Pigouvian tax is simply a per-unit tax set equal to the marginal external cost to move a market from its private optimum to the social optimum. It also connects to Unit 1 supply and demand shifts. Students who forget that the supply curve shifts by the tax amount and instead mistakenly move along the supply curve will consistently get wrong answers. One more classic trap, the quantity effect. After a tax, total revenue for the government equals the per unit tax multiplied by the new quantity Q sub T, not the original quantity. Use Q sub t in every calculation after the tax is imposed. With taxes and subsidies firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to bring everything together as we explore how governments use these tools alongside price controls and public goods provision to address the broader landscape of market failure across an entire economy. 6.15 Income inequality and the Lorenz curve. Setting the stage. Why this matters. Imagine you and 9 friends decide to split a pizza. A perfectly fair split means everyone gets 1 slice. But what if one person grabbed 4 slices, another grabbed 3, and the remaining 8 people had to share the last 3? That's essentially what economists are describing when they talk about income inequality, and the Lorenz curve is the tool we use to visualize exactly how lopsided that pizza distribution has become. For the AP exam, this topic sits at the intersection of normative economics, market failure, and government policy, which means it connects to almost everything in Unit 6. Let's make sure you understand every inch of it. The Lorenz curve. Drawing it, reading it, mastering it. The Lorenz curve is a graph that shows the cumulative share of income earned by cumulative shares of the population, ranked from lowest to highest earners. Let's unpack that slowly, because the exam loves to test whether you actually understand what cumulative means here. Here's how to draw it. Your horizontal axis represents the cumulative percentage of the population, running from 0% to 100%, with households ranked from the poorest on the left to the wealthiest on the right. Your vertical axis represents the cumulative percentage of income, also running from 0% to 100%. The first thing you draw is a straight diagonal line running from the origin, the bottom left corner at 0, 0, all the way to the top right corner at 100%, 100%. This line is called the line of perfect equality, and it represents a hypothetical world where every person earns exactly the same income. If the bottom 20% of the population earns exactly 20% of all income, and the bottom 40% earns exactly 40%, and so on, you'd be on this diagonal line the entire time. Now, in the real world, that's never what happens. The actual Lorenz curve bows below that line of perfect equality, like a smile or an archer's bow. That bow is the whole story. A point on the actual Lorenz curve might tell you, for example, that the bottom 40% of households earn only 15% of total income. The farther that curve sags away from the diagonal, the more unequal the income distribution. The closer it hugs the diagonal, the more equal the distribution. You need to be able to interpret any point on this curve and state clearly what it means, because the FRQ will almost certainly ask you to do exactly that. The Gini coefficient, putting a number on inequality. The Lorenz curve gives us a beautiful visual, but economists also want a single number that summarizes inequality, something we can compare across countries and across time. That number is the Gini coefficient, and here's the formula you need to know. The Gini coefficient equals the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve. Call that area A, divided by the total area under the line of perfect equality, which is the entire triangle. Call that area A plus area B. So, Gini coefficient equals a divided by A plus B. The Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. A Gini of 0 means perfect equality. The Lorenz curve and the diagonal are identical. Area A is 0, so the fraction is 0. A Gini of 1 means perfect inequality. One person earns literally all the income. The Lorenz curve collapses along the bottom and right axes. Area B vanishes, and the fraction approaches 1. In the real world, Gini coefficients fall somewhere in between. The United States, for reference, hovers around 0.39 to 0.41, which is relatively high for a developed nation. Scandinavian countries like Denmark sit closer to 0.28, reflecting their more compressed income distributions. Here's the key exam rule to tattoo on your brain. A higher Gini coefficient means more inequality. A lower Gini coefficient means less inequality. And when a policy reduces inequality, say a progressive income tax or a transfer payment like food stamps, the Lorenz curve shifts upward toward the diagonal and the Gini coefficient falls. Edge cases and MCQ traps you cannot afford to miss. The exam loves to test whether you confuse the direction of the Lorenz curve's shift with the direction of inequality's change. Remember, when the Lorenz curve moves toward the line of perfect equality, inequality decreases. When it bows further away, inequality increases. Don't let the visual confuse you. Closer to the diagonal always means more equal. Another classic trap involves comparing two Lorenz curves that cross each other. If country A's Lorenz curve and country B's Lorenz curve intersect, you cannot definitively say which country has more inequality. The Gini coefficient might differ, but the distribution is unequal in different ways across different income groups. The AP exam may present this scenario to see if you recognize that no clear ranking exists. Students also frequently mix up income inequality and wealth inequality. Income is the flow of earnings over a period of time: wages, salaries, dividends. Wealth is the stock of accumulated assets. Wealth inequality is typically far more severe than income inequality, and the Lorenz curve can technically be drawn for either, though AP Micro almost always focuses on income. Connecting to the bigger picture. This topic doesn't exist in isolation. The government interventions you studied earlier in Unit 6, progressive taxation, transfer payments, subsidies for public goods, are all policy responses to income inequality. When an FRQ asks you to evaluate a policy's effect on income distribution, you need to explain whether that policy moves the Lorenz curve toward or away from the diagonal and what happens to the Gini coefficient as a result. You should also connect this back to Unit 2's concept of consumer surplus and Unit 4's discussion of factor markets. Wages, the primary source of income for most households, are determined in labor markets. Differences in marginal revenue product, education, discrimination, and market power all feed directly into the shape of the Lorenz curve. When wages are compressed, say through a minimum wage or union bargaining, lower income workers earn more, shifting the curve upward and reducing the Gini. For FRQ scoring, if a question asks you to show a reduction in income inequality on a Lorenz curve diagram, you must draw the new curve closer to the line of perfect equality and explicitly label it as the new Lorenz curve. Leaving the graph unlabeled is a surefire way to lose a point. The Lorenz curve is ultimately a mirror that a society holds up to itself, and understanding what you see in it precisely and fluently is exactly what the College Board wants you to demonstrate. With that foundation firmly in place, let's turn to the government policies specifically designed to address these inequalities and explore how economists evaluate their trade-offs. 6.16 Gini coefficient. What is the Gini coefficient and why does it matter? Let's talk about inequality, not just as a vague concept you hear about in the news, but as something economists can actually measure. The Gini coefficient is the tool they use to do exactly that, and understanding it deeply is going to serve you well on the AP exam. Think of it this way. If you and your 9 friends each earned exactly the same amount, income distribution would be perfectly equal. But if one person earned everything and the other 9 earned nothing, you'd have perfect inequality. The Gini coefficient captures where any real economy falls on that spectrum, and it does so with elegant mathematical precision. The Gini coefficient is a number between 0 and 1, or sometimes expressed as a percentage between 0 and 100, that measures income inequality within a population. A Gini coefficient of 0 represents perfect equality, where every person or household earns exactly the same income. A Gini coefficient of 1 or 100% represents perfect inequality, where one person earns all the income and everyone else earns nothing. Real-world countries fall somewhere in between. Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden tend to cluster around 0.28 to 0.30, while the United States sits closer to 0.39 to 0.41, and highly unequal economies can push above 0.50. These numbers become much more meaningful once you understand the graph behind them. The Lorenz curve, your graph to master. The Gini coefficient doesn't exist in isolation. It's derived from a graph called the Lorenz curve, and this is the diagram you absolutely need to be able to draw, label, and interpret on the AP exam. Here's how to build it from scratch. Draw a square with both axes running from 0% to 100%. The horizontal axis represents the cumulative percentage of the population ranked from lowest income to highest. The vertical axis represents the cumulative percentage of total income earned. Now, draw a straight diagonal line from the bottom left corner, 0, 0 to the top right corner, 100, 100. This diagonal line is called the line of perfect equality because at every point along it, the bottom X% of the population earns exactly X% of income, the bottom 20% earns 20%, the bottom 50% earns 50%, and so on. The actual Lorenz curve is a bowed line that starts at the same origin point, 0, 0, and ends at the same destination, 100, 100, but it sags below the line of perfect equality. This bow shape reflects reality. The bottom 20% of earners typically earn far less than 20% of total income. The further the Lorenz curve bows away from the line of perfect equality, the greater the income inequality in that society. Now, here's the key connection. The Gini coefficient is calculated as the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve, divided by the total area of the triangle beneath the line of perfect equality. In formula terms, if you call the area between the diagonal and the Lorenz curve A, and the area under the Lorenz curve B, then the Gini coefficient equals A divided by A plus B. When inequality is low, the Lorenz curve hugs the diagonal, making area a very small relative to the whole triangle, and the Gini coefficient approaches 0. When inequality is extreme, the Lorenz curve bows sharply downward, area A grows large, and the Gini coefficient approaches 1. Reading changes in the Gini coefficient. For the AP exam, you need to connect policy changes and economic events to movements in the Lorenz curve and corresponding changes in the Gini coefficient. If a government implements a progressive income tax or expands transfer payments like food assistance or housing subsidies, income gets redistributed from higher earners toward lower earners. On the graph, this causes the Lorenz curve to shift upward, moving closer to the line of perfect equality, and the Gini coefficient falls. Conversely, if tax cuts disproportionately benefit the wealthy, or if wages at the top surge while wages at the bottom stagnate, the Lorenz curve bows further downward, and the Gini coefficient rises. A classic AP trap question will describe two countries or two time periods and ask you to identify which has greater inequality by comparing their Lorenz curves. Remember this rule clearly. The Lorenz curve that bows further from the diagonal represents greater inequality and corresponds to a higher Gini coefficient. If two Lorenz curves cross each other, and this is an edge case worth knowing, you cannot unambiguously rank inequality between the two using the Gini coefficient alone, because one group has more equality at lower income levels, while the other has more equality at upper income levels. The Gini coefficients might even be identical despite the curves having different shapes. The AP exam has tested this subtlety, so don't assume that two different looking Lorenz curves always produce different Gini values. Common misconceptions and exam traps. One trap that catches students every year involves confusing a higher Gini coefficient with a poorer country. These are completely separate measurements. A wealthy nation can have high inequality, high Gini, and a poorer nation can have relatively equal distribution, low Gini. The Gini coefficient measures the distribution of income, not the level of income. Those are different concepts you must keep distinct. A related misconception is thinking that government intervention always improves a Gini coefficient. It depends entirely on which interventions are used and who benefits. A regressive tax that takes a higher percentage from low-income earners would worsen inequality and raise the Gini coefficient, even though it's still technically a government policy. Another common mistake is misidentifying what shifts the Lorenz curve. When income inequality increases, the Lorenz curve shifts away from the diagonal. That means it shifts downward and to the right. Students sometimes get confused about direction. Anchor yourself to the visual. A Lorenz curve further from the perfect equality line always means more inequality and always means a higher Gini coefficient. Connections to the rest of the course. The Gini coefficient ties directly into the broader themes of Unit 6 around market failure and the role of government. Markets can produce efficient outcomes, but may generate highly unequal distributions of income, a form of market failure in the equity sense rather than the efficiency sense. This connects to your understanding of positive and negative externalities, public goods, and why governments intervene. The Gini coefficient also links back to factor markets from Unit 5. Wages, rents, and returns to capital all shape income distribution. If wages in competitive labor markets fall, or if wage discrimination persists, the Lorenz curve bows further outward. When you see FRQ questions asking you to analyze government programs, minimum wage laws, progressive taxation, transfer payments, you should be prepared to explain the impact on the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient as part of your full response, as these are reliable rubric point opportunities. With income inequality now firmly in your analytical toolkit, we turn next to the broader policy question of how governments actually respond to market failures, including both the corrective tools available and the limitations of government intervention itself. 6.17 Government Policies to Address Market Failure and Promote Equity. Let's bring everything together. You've spent this entire unit learning why markets sometimes fail, externalities, public goods, imperfect information, market power, and now we're asking the natural follow-up question. What does the government actually do about it? This section is the policy toolkit, and it's one of the most exam-dense topics in all of Unit 6. So grab your coffee, because we're going to walk through every tool, every graph, and every trap the College Board loves to throw at you. The big picture, why government intervenes. Start with the foundation. Markets fail when the price mechanism doesn't produce the socially optimal quantity. That is, when the quantity where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost isn't being reached by private buyers and sellers alone. Government intervention exists to close that gap. The two broad goals here are efficiency, getting output to the socially optimal level, and equity, making sure the distribution of resources and opportunities is fair. These goals sometimes reinforce each other and sometimes conflict, and the AP exam loves to test whether you can tell the difference. Correcting negative externalities, taxes and regulation. When a market produces too much of something, think pollution from a factory. The social cost exceeds the private cost. The market equilibrium sits to the right of the social optimum. The classic government response is a Pigouvian tax, named after economist Arthur Pigou. Here's how to draw this on your graph. Start with your standard supply and demand diagram. The supply curve represents marginal private cost. Now draw a second supply curve shifted upward and to the left. That's marginal social cost, reflecting the external cost to third parties. The market equilibrium, where demand meets marginal private cost, is at a quantity that is too high and a price that is too low compared to the social optimum, where demand meets marginal social cost. The deadweight loss triangle sits between those two equilibrium points. A Pigouvian tax shifts the supply curve upward by exactly the amount of the external cost per unit. When correctly set, the tax forces producers to internalize the externality. They now pay for the harm they impose on others. After the tax, market equilibrium moves to the socially optimal quantity. The deadweight loss disappears. This is the key exam point. A correctly sized Pigouvian tax eliminates deadweight loss and achieves allocative efficiency. The size of the tax should equal the marginal external cost at the optimal quantity. That's your formula. Tax equals MEC at Q ties stopped. But governments can also use direct regulation like emission caps to reduce output to Q ties spite. But the AP exam distinguishes these. Taxes work through the price mechanism and preserve some flexibility for firms, while command and control regulation sets hard limits. Correcting positive externalities, subsidies and provision. Flip the picture for positive externalities like education or vaccines. Here, the market produces too little because private buyers only account for their own benefit, not the benefit they generate for society. Your graph now shows marginal social benefit sitting above the demand curve, which represents marginal private benefit. The market equilibrium quantity is too low, and there's a deadweight loss triangle to the right of market equilibrium and to the left of the social optimum. The government can respond with a per-unit subsidy to consumers or producers, shifting the relevant curve until market output reaches Q. The subsidy should equal the marginal external benefit at the optimal quantity. Subsidy equals MEB at Q. Alternatively, the government can directly provide the good. Think public schools or public health programs, especially when the good has public good characteristics. Public goods and government provision. Public goods are non-rival and non-excludable, which means private markets will underprovide them due to the free rider problem. Nobody pays for national defense voluntarily, so private firms won't supply it at all. The government response is direct provision funded by taxation. On the exam, be careful. Government provision doesn't mean government production necessarily. The government might contract private firms to build roads. What matters is that the government funds and ensures provision because the market fails entirely. Promoting equity, redistribution policies. Now shift gears to equity. Even when markets are efficient, the resulting distribution of income might be deeply unequal. Government tools here include progressive income taxes, where higher earners pay a larger percentage, transfer payments like Social Security, food assistance, or unemployment benefits, and in-kind transfers like Medicaid or housing vouchers that provide specific goods rather than cash. The AP exam expects you to understand the trade-off. Redistribution policies can reduce inequality and improve equity, but they may also reduce efficiency by creating disincentive effects. A higher marginal tax rate, for example, might reduce the incentive to work or invest. This is the efficiency-equity trade-off, and it's one of the most commonly tested concepts in this section. Price controls as equity tools. Price ceilings, like rent control, and price floors, like minimum wage, are also equity-motivated policies. You should already know from Unit 2 how to graph these, but here's the Unit 6 connection. Price controls address equity concerns, but create deadweight loss and inefficiency. A price ceiling set below equilibrium creates a shortage and reduces total surplus. A price floor set above equilibrium creates a surplus. The exam loves to ask you to identify both the equity motivation and the efficiency cost simultaneously. Know both sides of that argument. The common exam traps. Several traps appear repeatedly on both the multiple choice and free response sections. First, students confuse the direction of a Pigouvian tax. It shifts the supply curve up for a producer tax or the demand curve down for a consumer tax, not both. Second, many students incorrectly apply subsidies to negative externality situations. Subsidies correct, positive externalities, taxes correct, negative ones, never the reverse. Third, watch out for questions asking whether a policy achieves allocative efficiency. It only does so if the intervention moves output exactly to cutes up, where MSB equals MSC. An overcorrection creates a new deadweight loss on the other side. Fourth, don't confuse equity and equality. Equity means fairness in distribution, which sometimes means unequal treatment, like a progressive tax. Connections to other units. This section is a culminating synthesis topic, so it connects to nearly everything you've studied. The externality graphs build directly on Unit 1's supply and demand framework. Public goods connect back to the concepts of market failure introduced in 6.1 through 6.10. The efficiency equity trade-off echoes the production possibilities frontier trade-offs from Unit 1. And redistribution policy connects to factor markets in Unit 5, since wages and incomes flow from those markets. When an FRQ asks you to use a correctly labeled graph to show the effect of a per-unit tax, they are testing your ability to integrate all of this seamlessly. With your government policy toolkit now fully assembled, you're ready to see how all of these microeconomic principles tie together when you encounter comprehensive exam questions that blend multiple units, which is exactly what the AP exam's most challenging free response questions are designed to do. 6.18 Market Failure Summary, comparing types and policy responses. All right, let's pull back to the 30,000-foot view. You've spent all of Unit 6 learning about the ways markets can break down: externalities, public goods, imperfect information, and market power. Now it's time to do what the AP exam loves to test: comparison. Not just what is a negative externality, but given this scenario, which type of market failure is it? What does the graph look like, and what should the government do about it? That synthesis is exactly what separates a 3 from a 5. So let's build the complete mental map together. The 4 types of market failure, side by side. Think of markets like a sports referee. Most of the time, the rules work fine on their own. But market failure is when the referee falls asleep, when the price system fails to allocate resources efficiently on its own. The AP exam recognizes 4 major sources of market failure, and you need to distinguish them quickly. First, externalities, costs or benefits that spill over onto third parties who aren't part of the transaction. When your neighbor's coal plant gives you asthma, that's a negative externality. The market overproduces because the producer doesn't pay the full social cost. Visually, think of the supply curve sitting too far to the right. The private marginal cost curve is below where social marginal cost actually sits. The socially optimal output is less than the market output, and that gap creates a deadweight loss triangle on the upper right side of the equilibrium. For positive externalities, like your neighbor planting a beautiful garden, the market underproduces because the buyer doesn't capture all the social benefit. Now, the demand curve is too far left. Private marginal benefit is below social marginal benefit, and the deadweight loss triangle sits on the upper left side. Second, public goods, goods that are non-excludable and non-rival. The classic examples are national defense and lighthouses, because you can't exclude free riders, and one person's consumption doesn't diminish another's. Private markets produce too little or none at all. This is the free rider problem. No firm will voluntarily build a lighthouse if every passing ship benefits without paying. The AP exam rarely asks you to graph public goods explicitly, but you absolutely need to know the 2 defining characteristics and why they cause underproduction. Third, imperfect information, when buyers and sellers don't have the same knowledge. Think of the used car market. The seller knows the car's history. The buyer doesn't. This asymmetry, which economist George Akerlof called the market for lemons problem, drives good cars out of the market and leaves only bad ones. In health insurance, this shows up as adverse selection. The sickest people are most eager to buy coverage, which raises premiums, which drives healthy people out, which raises premiums further. Imperfect information can cause both overproduction and underproduction, depending on the scenario. Fourth, market power, when a single seller, monopoly, or a few sellers, oligopoly, can set prices above marginal cost. Unlike the other three sources of market failure, this one doesn't involve a missing market or an externality. It's about firms with pricing power restricting output to maximize profit, creating a deadweight loss triangle between the competitive equilibrium and the monopoly equilibrium. The policy responses, matching the tool to the problem. Here's where students lose points. They memorize the market failures but mix up which policy fixes which failure. Let's lock this in. For negative externalities, the government can internalize the externality by imposing a Pigouvian tax equal to the marginal external cost. Graphically, this shifts the private supply curve left until it coincides with the social marginal cost curve output, falls to the socially optimal level, and the deadweight loss disappears. For positive externalities, a Pigouvian subsidy shifts either the demand or supply curve right to close the gap between private and social benefit. On the FRQ, if they ask you to show the effect of a corrective tax, you must shift supply left, label the new equilibrium, and show that the deadweight loss triangle is eliminated. That labeling earns you points. For public goods, the typical government response is direct provision. The government simply provides the good using tax revenue. The exam might also ask you about the Coase theorem as an alternative to government intervention. If property rights are clearly defined and transaction costs are low, private parties can negotiate a solution to externalities without government help. Know its conditions: clear property rights, low transaction costs, and a small number of affected parties. Real-world application: 2 neighboring farmers negotiating water rights. For imperfect information, policy tools include mandatory disclosure laws, requiring sellers to reveal known defects, licensing requirements, ensuring professionals have verified skills, and warranties, signaling quality to buyers. For adverse selection in health insurance, the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate was designed to force healthy people back into the risk pool, a classic policy response to adverse selection worth knowing for the exam. For market power, the government uses antitrust laws to break up monopolies or block anti-competitive mergers, and regulation to force natural monopolies to price at average cost or marginal cost. Remember, a regulated natural monopoly priced at marginal cost will earn economic losses because its declining average cost curve means MC is below ATC, which is why governments often allow average cost pricing as a compromise. The graphs you must be able to draw. Every type of market failure has a signature graph. For externalities, you need the double supply or demand diagram showing private versus social curves, the market equilibrium, the socially optimal equilibrium, and the deadweight loss triangle. Remember, deadweight loss always represents foregone gains from trade. The value society loses because output is at the wrong level. For monopoly, you need the downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue curve below it with twice the slope, the MC and ATC curves, and the deadweight loss triangle between the competitive and monopoly quantities. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. The single most common trap on this topic is misidentifying which direction the deadweight loss triangle points. For a negative externality, the market produces too much, so the DWL triangle is to the right of optimal. For a monopoly, the firm produces too little, so the DWL triangle is to the left of competitive output. Students flip these constantly under pressure. Draw it slowly, check the direction, and verify by asking, is too much being produced or too little? Another trap, confusing the Pigouvian tax with a regular excise tax. Both shift supply left, but only the Pigouvian tax is set equal to the marginal external cost and eliminates the DWL. A tax set at the wrong level just creates a different distortion. On FRQs, the College Board is very specific. They want you to use the phrase deadweight loss and show it as a shaded triangle. If you describe it in words without the visual and the label, you likely won't earn full credit. Practice drawing all 4 market failure graphs until your hand does it automatically. Cross-unit connections. This summary section ties directly back to Unit 2's supply and demand model, Unit 4's monopoly analysis, and Unit 5's factor markets. When you see an FRQ asking about government intervention in a labor market, like a minimum wage in a monopsony, you're blending Unit 5 with Unit 6 market failure concepts. The AP exam loves these hybrid questions. With the full picture of market failure now assembled in your mind, the causes, the graphs, the policies, and the traps, you're ready to tackle what comes next. Connecting these microeconomic principles to the broader conversation about government's role in a mixed economy and how efficiency trade-offs appear in real policy debate.